Support for the arts is an essential element of cultural policy, yet there's much more to culture than the arts. While Whitlam had articulated a comprehensive arts policy in the 1970s, it wasn't until the 1990s that Australia had its first fully fledged cultural policy. The moment didn't necessarily last, with subsequent government support effectively withdrawn. Nonetheless, its ideational legacy lived on. Official cultural policy may be absent at present. Even so, the cultural guidelines and objectives of the past continue to resonate in contemporary cultural practices. In the 1980s, there is a new vibrancy to Australia, and this is reflected in its artworks. The art scene became saturated with colourful works by Ken Doane. Similarly, patterned knitwear by Jenny Key were worn everywhere. Upbeat, unself-conscious celebration of Aussie culture hit the top of the music charts with Men at Work's Land Down Under. During this time, the arts underwent the same treatment as all government and industry activities as the new managerialism and economic rationalism took over as the motivating force for all national activity. This neoliberalism meant the arts was given economic objectives rather than being all about culture. The idea of an arts industry was the new order of the day. While the leadership under Bob Hawke favoured sport and everyday culture, the new public administration culture required demonstration of performance against access and equity targets, so funding became concentrated on arts employment, youth arts, cultural pursuits, folk life and Indigenous arts, measuring, reporting, meeting targets. Added to this was the concern of the leadership to consider how best to ensure its support for the arts was driven by its whole-of-government approach to its vision for a more regionally engaged Australia. The result was the publication of Creative Nation, Commonwealth Cultural Policy, in 1994. The first occasion an Australian federal government had articulated a clear vision of its cultural policy. The whole idea was to take an economic approach to the cultural sector in the same way as the government was reforming other sectors of the economy, by targeting underperforming or under-resourced cultural organisations. The government intended to facilitate greater citizen engagement with culture, thereby boosting audiences and assisting in community and identity building. Initiatives were designed to expand Australia's cultural sector by taking account of Keating's policies of relocating Australia to Asia. In line with international thinking, cultural policy was recast in terms of the idea of building cultural capital. This concentrated on recognising the contribution to culture of the various ethnic communities in Australia, as well as highlighting Australia's unique Indigenous culture. In defining culture, it said, "We seek to preserve our culture because it is fundamental to our understanding of who we are. It is the name we go by, the house in which we live. Culture is that which gives us a sense of ourselves." And so Creative Nation expanded the definition of culture to include film, TV, radio, multimedia, cultural heritage, cultural industries, libraries, Indigenous culture, regional cultural outreach, and cultural tourism. Initiatives to promote the growth of the cultural sector included education and training, copyright, export initiative schemes, taxation initiatives, sponsorship and other facilitation schemes. While the program was never fully implemented, as Keating's successor John Howard, a cultural relativist, sought to return Australian culture to its Anglo roots, the ideas still managed to get some traction and pretty much implemented themselves, albeit without the essential element of state funding. It was to be another 2 decades before the successor to Keating's Creative Nation was delivered. Julia Gillard's 2013 Creative Australia policy was, she said, a fresh expression of the values and priorities that will sustain Australia as a richly creative society in the 21st century. It affirms the centrality of the arts to our national identity, social cohesion, and economic success. The policy had 5 main aims, beginning with an affirmation of the centrality of Australia's Indigenous culture as the foundation of a uniquely Australian culture, and acknowledging the contribution that diversity makes to the thriving creativity that is essential to Australia's successful future. Again, the policy was delivered towards the end of her leadership, so didn't enjoy much of a moment in the sun. The current government has pulled back from overarching cultural policy. Its only real contribution has been Arts Nation, a report on the arts sector in 2015. The report purely focuses on the economic aspects of the arts industry in Australia, including funding, audiences, diversity, and research. There's been a major shift towards corporate sponsorship, while ongoing budgetary support for the sector has been cut. Like most things these days, funding for the arts is via ad hoc grants, which largely depend on the political imperatives of the day. With little interest in understanding their importance as a mechanism for social inclusion, arts and culture appear to have passed the government by entirely. Instead, the main business of the cultural industries has become demonstrating its value to governments, the business sector, and the public in general. Like that for all countries, Australian culture is the complex outcome of its contingent historical development. Yet effective cultural policy has been a significant structuring influence. This is particularly evident in the contemporary globalised market-based culture of today, where the importance of the concept of innovation has become critical to Australia's place in the world. It's become increasingly important that cultural leaders and policymakers looked beyond economic metrics for activities whose real worth lies in the telling and retelling of our own stories. Culture isn't just material things. As Stuart Hall says, culture is concerned with the production and the exchange of meanings between members of a society or group. Culture has to do with how we make sense of the world and how we produce, reproduce, and circulate sense. It's about how we see ourselves, how we see each other, and how the rest of the world comes to understand who we are as Australians. It is essential that a new national cultural policy is formulated that moves beyond the conception of culture as merely an industry sector that is all about contributing to innovation and lifting productivity. In this increasingly fractured global society, there needs to be a new awareness of the urgent need to promote cultural diversity and connection within Australia and beyond. And what better way to do that than through the promotion of well-articulated and well-funded national, regional and local cultural policies and practices. I'm Diane Colman. Thank you for watching.